My wife laughed at my $200 suit. 10 minutes later, the chairman handed me the room. Funny how respect works in corporate America. Some people measure a man by the label stitched inside his jacket. Others wait until he opens his mouth. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 42 years old, born and raised outside Columbus, Ohio. And if you had seen me that Thursday evening, you would have mistaken me for exactly what everyone in that ballroom believed I was. An ordinary husband tagging along to his wife's company gala. The hotel overlooked downtown Chicago, 38 floors above the city, where the windows reflected a skyline glowing against the early autumn sky. Crystal chandeliers spilled warm light across polished marble floors. Servers floated through the crowd carrying silver trays of champagne and miniature crab cakes. The room smelled of expensive perfume, cedar cologne, and the quiet confidence that always seemed to surround people with executive titles. My charcoal gray suit had cost exactly $198 after tax. I remembered because I'd smiled when the cashier handed me the receipt 3 years earlier. The tailor had adjusted the sleeves for another $40, and ever since then it had fit me better than suits that cost 10 times as much. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't designer. It simply fit. I'd always believed that was enough. Apparently, my wife disagreed. Madison stood beside me in a navy evening gown that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. She looked exactly like someone climbing the corporate ladder should look. Confident, elegant, perfect posture. Every executive who walked past greeted her by name. She smiled effortlessly, shaking hands, laughing at conversations before they were even finished. Watching her move through that room, you would have assumed she belonged there. Maybe she did. Then she looked at me. Her smile changed just enough for only me to notice. "Ethan," she whispered without moving her lips. "Couldn't you have borrowed something nicer tonight?" I glanced down at my jacket. "What's wrong with this one?" She sighed softly. "It's fine." There are few words colder than fine when spoken by someone embarrassed to stand beside you. Before I could answer, one of her coworkers walked over carrying 2 glasses of champagne. Chad Bennett, Vice President of Operations. Mid-40s. Perfect white smile. Tailored Italian tuxedo. The kind of man who never loosened his tie because he enjoyed reminding everyone else how expensive it was. "Madison," he said warmly before finally acknowledging me. "And you must be Ethan." He extended his hand. His grip was firm. "Practiced. Good to finally meet you." "Likewise," I replied. His eyes drifted over my suit for less than a second. Most people wouldn't have noticed. I did. People reveal themselves in moments they think nobody sees. "You know," Chad said with a grin, "I almost bought that exact jacket once. Then my son convinced me to spend a little more." Madison laughed. Not loudly. Just enough. Just enough for me to hear it. "Don't encourage him," she joked. "He's proud of finding bargains." A few others nearby smiled politely. Nobody intended to be cruel. That's what makes moments like those so dangerous. Humiliation rarely arrives shouting. Most of the time, it whispers while everyone else calls it harmless fun. I smiled back. "I've always believed money should work harder than appearances." Chad chuckled. "That's one philosophy." Then someone called his name, and he disappeared into another conversation. Madison didn't look at me for several seconds. Finally, she exhaled. "You always do that." "Do what?" "Make everything awkward." I stared across the ballroom, where executives clustered beneath the stage, discussing quarterly numbers over crystal glasses. I answered a question. "You answered it like you wanted everyone to think you're smarter than they are." I almost laughed. Instead, I reached for a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray. "Is that really what happened?" She shook her head. "Just tonight, please don't embarrass me." Funny thing about marriage. Sometimes the sharpest wounds come wrapped inside reasonable requests. I wasn't angry. Not yet. Mostly, I felt tired. Tired in the way only years of quiet misunderstandings can make a person feel. We'd been married 15 years. Long. Enough to finish each other's grocery lists. Long enough to know exactly how the other person took their coffee. Long enough that silence often replaced conversations neither of us wanted to have. There had been a time when Madison admired how little I cared about expensive things. She used to call it confidence. Somewhere along the way, she started calling it settling. I honestly couldn't tell when the definition changed. The string quartet near the ballroom entrance transitioned into a softer melody as more executives filtered inside. Waiters refreshed drinks. A giant screen behind the stage displayed the company's blue and silver logo alongside the words Annual Leadership Recognition Gala. Everyone expected awards, speeches, and another predictable corporate celebration. Nobody expected what was coming. Neither did I. My phone vibrated once inside my jacket pocket. I ignored it. Probably spam. 30 seconds later it vibrated again. Then again. 3 calls in less than a minute from the same contact. Robert Whitman. I looked at the screen, frowned slightly, and slipped the phone back into my pocket without answering. Whatever it was could wait another few minutes. I had no idea those unanswered calls were about to change every life inside that ballroom. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, telling myself that whatever Robert Whitman wanted could survive another 5 minutes. People like him did not usually call 3 times in a row, but years of experience had taught me that urgency often looked different depending on who was holding the clock. Around me, the ballroom buzzed with polished conversations about market forecasts, acquisitions, and leadership awards. It sounded impressive until you listened closely. Most of it was rehearsed confidence wrapped in expensive vocabulary. Madison accepted compliments with effortless grace, introducing herself to directors from regional offices as though she had already earned the promotion everyone expected her to receive. Watching her smile reminded me of the first apartment we rented after college. Back then she would laugh because we had to use folding chairs instead of a dining table. We had celebrated buying our first coffee maker like it was a luxury appliance. Success used to mean paying every bill before the due date. Somewhere along the road, success had started wearing designer labels. I was still standing near one of the marble columns when another vibration rolled through my jacket. Robert again. This time he left a voicemail before immediately calling once more. I let the phone ring out. My attention shifted toward the large stage where employees were beginning to take their seats. Giant screens displayed company milestones from the past decade, while soft piano music filled the room. The annual leadership gala always followed the same predictable script. Welcome speech. Recognition awards. Chairman remarks. Charity announcement. Dinner. Networking. Home before 11. Predictability was comforting. Until it disappeared. Chad returned carrying another glass of champagne, smiling as though we were old friends. He glanced toward my wrist. No watch tonight, he asked. Most of us around here collect them like baseball cards. I looked at my bare wrist and smiled politely. I have never needed one that costs more than my first car. Several executives laughed. Chad raised an eyebrow. That explains it. Madison forced a smile, but I recognized the tension behind it. She wanted this evening to go perfectly. She wanted her coworkers to remember her presentation from last quarter, not her husband making philosophical comments about money. One of the senior directors joined the conversation. So Ethan, what line of work are you in? I answered honestly. Mostly consulting these days. Consulting? Chad asked. What kind? Corporate governance. Risk management. Sometimes restructuring. He nodded with polite interest that quickly faded. Freelance. Something like that. He grinned again. Flexible schedule. Must be nice. I simply nodded. Explaining my work had become exhausting years ago because the truth always required too much context. The less I said, the more people filled in the blanks themselves. Usually they assumed I worked from home because I could not find a real executive position. I had learned to let assumptions breathe. They often revealed more about the listener than the speaker. Madison gently touched my arm. Excuse us for a second. She guided me a few steps away from the group until the conversations around us became softer. Her smile disappeared the moment nobody else was looking. Could you please stop doing that? She asked quietly. Doing what? Giving mysterious answers. I answered every question they asked. Exactly. They think you are hiding something. Am I? She looked at me for a long second before shaking her head. You always turn everything into a puzzle. I wanted to tell her that the only puzzle in the room was how 2 people could spend 15 years together and still stop seeing each other clearly. Instead, I simply said, I did not come here to impress anyone. That is obvious. Her words landed softly, but they stayed there. Before either of us could continue, every screen in the ballroom suddenly went dark. The music stopped in the middle of a note. Conversations faded into confused silence. Hotel staff exchanged uncertain glances while technicians hurried toward the stage. The microphone produced a brief burst of static before going quiet again. Something was wrong. Not catastrophic. Just unusual enough that every executive instinctively reached for a phone. Mine vibrated once more. This time it was not a call. It was a message from Robert Whitman. For words. Where are you now? I stared at the screen for a second longer than I intended. Madison noticed. Who keeps calling? She asked. An old colleague. She nodded distractedly, already watching employees whispering near the stage. Across the ballroom, I noticed several members of the board entering through a private side door instead of the main entrance. None of them looked relaxed. One carried a thick folder against his chest. Another spoke urgently into a headset. They were not heading toward the banquet tables. They were moving directly toward the executive conference wing behind the ballroom. I had seen that look before. Calm faces covering urgent decisions. Companies only moved that way when something serious had happened. My phone rang again. Robert Whitman. This time, before I could decide whether to answer, the ballroom doors opened wide. Every conversation stopped as an elderly man with silver hair walked inside, flanked by two members of corporate security. Robert did not glance at the stage. He did not acknowledge the guests waiting for speeches. His eyes swept across hundreds of people until they stopped on me. Robert Whitman walked with the steady pace of a man who had spent decades making decisions that moved billions of dollars without ever needing to raise his voice. The ballroom instinctively parted for him. Conversations died one by one until the only sounds left were polished shoes crossing marble and the distant hum of the hotel air conditioning. Everyone expected him to head toward the stage. Instead, he changed direction and walked straight toward me. I watched dozens of faces turn in quiet confusion. Madison noticed it too. Her posture stiffened beside me. Chad stopped in the middle of another conversation, following the chairman with the same puzzled expression spreading across the room. Robert finally stopped less than 3 feet away. His expression remained calm, but there was no mistaking the urgency behind his eyes. Mr. Walker, he said clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear. I have been trying to reach you. For a brief second, nobody moved. Madison looked from Robert to me as though she expected him to apologize for confusing me with someone else. I slipped my phone from my pocket and offered a small smile. I saw your calls. Robert nodded once. Then you already know we have a problem. I suspected something had happened. Something has. He glanced toward the executive conference hallway before returning his attention to me. The board is assembled. We cannot begin without you. Silence spread farther than any announcement could have reached. Chad blinked twice before forcing a polite laugh. Chairman, I think you may have the wrong guest. Robert looked at him with professional courtesy. I assure you, I do not. Chad's smile faded almost immediately. Madison stared at me. Ethan, what is he talking about? I held her gaze for a moment before answering quietly. Apparently, there is an emergency meeting. Apparently, she repeated, almost whispering. Robert checked his watch. We have less than 15 minutes before the market in Tokyo opens. Timing matters tonight. The sentence landed differently on everyone standing nearby. Executives understood deadlines. Directors understood global markets. Board members understood that meetings called under those conditions were never routine. Robert turned slightly toward the ballroom. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for interrupting your evening. Due to unforeseen circumstances, the scheduled program will be delayed. Murmurs immediately filled the room. People reached for phones. Rumors formed before facts ever had the chance. Madison gently touched my sleeve. Why would the board need you? There was no accusation in her voice anymore. Only confusion. I answered with the truth that revealed almost nothing. Because sometimes experience matters more than titles. She frowned. Experience doing what? Before I could respond, Robert spoke first. Mr. Walker has advised this board through situations far more difficult than tonight. Chad laughed again, but this time the sound carried uncertainty instead of confidence. Consulting, huh? I met his eyes without changing my expression. Something like that. Robert extended a leather folder toward me. The preliminary reports arrived 10 minutes ago. I accepted it without opening it. Even the weight of the folder told me enough. Financial reports always felt heavier when they carried consequences. Madison looked at the folder, then back at me. You knew the chairman? For quite a while. How long? Long before you joined the company. She searched my face as though hoping I was making some elaborate joke. Instead, she found the same calm expression I had worn all evening. Around us, whispers spread faster than the hotel staff could reassure anyone. I heard fragments drifting across the ballroom. Who is he? Why him? Did you know about this? Is he outside counsel? One executive quietly told another that he had seen my name before, but could not remember where. Another insisted I must be a crisis attorney. None of them guessed correctly. Robert motioned toward the private hallway. We should go. I nodded once. Before taking my first step, I turned toward Madison. She looked smaller somehow, not physically, but emotionally, as if the certainty she had carried into the ballroom had begun slipping away one unanswered question at a time. I will be back when the meeting is finished, I said. She hesitated before speaking. Ethan, is there something about you that I do not know? I almost answered. Instead, I offered the only response that felt honest. There are parts of my career we never really talked about. Her eyes widened slightly. Why? I looked across the ballroom where polished shoes, designer suits, and expensive watches filled the room with symbols of success. Because when I came home, I wanted to be your husband, not another executive. Robert placed a respectful hand near my shoulder without touching me. Time is against us. Together we walked toward the secured conference wing. Behind us I could feel hundreds of eyes following every step. The ballroom doors closed quietly once we entered the private corridor, shutting out the music, the whispers, and the assumptions. Ahead of us stood two security officers outside a pair of walnut doors. One of them immediately straightened. Good evening, Mr. Walker, he said before unlocking the entrance. The board has been waiting. The conference room felt nothing like the ballroom we had just left behind. There were no chandeliers, no music, no carefully rehearsed smiles. Only a long walnut table, 12 leather chairs, multiple monitors glowing with financial reports, and the quiet tension that settles over people when billions of dollars are suddenly uncertain. Every conversation stopped the second I walked through the door. 11 directors turned toward me almost at once. Some nodded respectfully. Others looked relieved. None of them looked surprised. That alone would have shocked anyone from the ballroom. Robert Whitman closed the door behind us. Ladies and gentlemen, he said calmly, Mr. Walker is here. A gray-haired woman seated near the center of the table removed her reading glasses and smiled. Good. We can finally begin. I recognized Susan Keller immediately. Former chief financial officer. One of the sharpest financial minds I had ever worked with. Across from her sat Daniel Brooks, chairman of the audit committee. He gave me a simple nod before sliding another folder toward my chair. Everything is inside, he said. The preliminary findings came in 22 minutes ago. I took my seat without ceremony. The chair at the head of the table had remained empty. It always had whenever I attended these meetings. Robert looked at me. Would you like the briefing first? No, I answered. I want the facts exactly as they arrived. Susan activated one of the displays. Charts filled the screen. Revenue projections. Internal transfers. Compliance reports. None of them looked unusual at first glance. That was the problem. The most dangerous numbers rarely announced themselves. They hid inside ordinary patterns until someone knew exactly where to look. Daniel cleared his throat. 3 hours ago, our external auditors discovered inconsistencies inside the fourth quarter acquisition reserves. Material? I asked. Potentially very material. Intentional? He hesitated. That is what we cannot determine yet. I slowly opened the leather folder Robert had handed me in the hallway. Every page had already been color-coded. Someone had prepared for a very long night. My eyes moved across the summaries in silence. By the third page, I noticed the pattern. By the fifth page, I knew exactly where to look next. By the seventh page, I quietly closed the folder again. Robert watched my expression. You found something. Maybe. Susan leaned forward. That quickly. The numbers are not lying, I replied. They are simply pointing in the wrong direction. Several directors exchanged confused glances. I stood and walked toward the largest monitor. Show me the acquisition timeline from 18 months ago. Within seconds, another chart appeared. Colored bars stretched across the screen, representing dozens of transactions completed over the previous year and a half. I studied them without speaking. Silence has value. Most executives rush to fill it. Experience teaches you to let silence do part of the work. Finally, I pointed toward one transaction completed. 14 months earlier. Start here. Daniel frowned. That deal already passed 2 independent reviews. I know. Then why? Because whoever built this wanted everyone to keep looking somewhere else. Susan's eyes narrowed. She immediately began typing. New reports appeared beside the original timeline. Robert folded his hands without interrupting. He had seen this process before. Years earlier, he had once told me that my greatest strength was not finding answers. It was asking questions nobody else realized they had skipped. 5 quiet minutes passed before Susan suddenly stopped typing. Wait. Her voice was barely above a whisper. There is another authorization code attached to this transfer. Daniel leaned closer. That should not exist. No, I agreed calmly. It should not. The room grew noticeably quieter. Susan opened another document. This code bypassed standard approval procedures. Robert finally spoke. Can anyone in this room authorize that level of override? Every director slowly shook their head. Daniel looked directly at me. Except one person. I met his eyes but said nothing. He turned toward Robert. The emergency governance protocol. Robert nodded once. Exactly. Several newer board members looked completely lost. One finally spoke. Forgive me, but I joined after that policy was created. Robert rested both hands on the table. The emergency governance protocol exists only for situations capable of threatening the long-term stability of the company. It has only been activated once. The director looked around the room. Who designed it? Nobody answered immediately. Susan simply looked toward me. Daniel followed her eyes. Then Robert smiled faintly before speaking the words that changed the atmosphere inside the room even more than his arrival had changed the ballroom. Mr. Walker wrote the governance framework this board still operates under today. Nearly every emergency procedure in this company carries his signature. Silence settled across the table again. I looked down at my inexpensive charcoal suit resting against the leather chair and almost smiled to myself. Outside that room, people had spent the evening judging fabric, watches, shoes, and titles. Inside this room, none of those things mattered. Only decisions did. And judging by the reports now appearing across every monitor, the hardest decisions of the night had not even begun. I remained standing beside the monitor while the room absorbed Robert's words. Nobody reached for a coffee cup. Nobody checked a phone. The only sound came from the ventilation system, pushing cool air through the ceiling vents. Susan slowly leaned back in her chair, still studying the transaction history displayed across 3 different screens. If someone intentionally built this sequence, she said, they understood every safeguard we ever created. I nodded, which means they either helped build the system or spent years learning how to move around it. Daniel folded his hands together. Either possibility is disturbing. Yes, I replied, but only one of them explains why the pattern stayed invisible for so long. Robert looked toward the legal counsel seated near the far end of the table. Has anyone outside this room been informed? No. We limited access to the audit committee and external investigators. Good. Robert turned back toward me. What would you do first? It was a simple question, the kind that always sounds easier than it really is. I looked around the table before answering. Nobody leaves this room with assumptions. Facts only. Fear spreads faster than numbers. We control information until we understand the full picture. Several directors quietly nodded. Experience teaches executives that uncertainty can destroy confidence long before actual losses ever appear. Susan brought another report onto the screen. There is something else. A spreadsheet filled with executive authorization logs appeared beside the financial data. Every approval carried a digital signature, timestamp, and security certificate. Most looked routine. One did not. I walked closer until I could read the identification code. Freeze that screen. Susan enlarged the record. The room became silent again. Daniel spoke first. That authorization belongs to the chief executive officer. Yes, I answered calmly. But notice the timestamp. Susan's eyes widened. He was in London that day. Robert immediately understood the implication, meaning someone authenticated the approval from inside headquarters. Correct. Another director frowned. Could it have been delegated? I shook my head. Not under this protocol. The system was intentionally designed to prevent exactly that. Susan looked toward me with growing concern. Then either someone compromised executive credentials, or someone wanted us to believe they did. I finished. Robert smiled faintly. You still think like an investigator. I returned a small smile. Bad habits tend to survive retirement. That word lingered in the room longer than I expected. Retirement. Most people assumed I had simply stepped away from corporate life because I wanted peace. The truth was more complicated. 20 years earlier, I had helped rescue 3 companies from financial collapse before my 40th birthday. Every crisis had demanded longer hours, harder decisions, and another piece of the life waiting for me at home. By the time Madison and I celebrated our 5th wedding anniversary, I realized I remembered quarterly earnings better than birthdays. One evening, she looked across our kitchen table and quietly asked me a question I never forgot. "When you walk through the front door, are you my husband or are you still at work?" I could not answer her. Not honestly. 6 months later, I resigned from every executive position I held. Friends called me crazy. Recruiters doubled their offers. One investment firm promised enough money to buy 3 houses on Lake Michigan. I declined every one of them. Robert had been the only person who understood. "You are not leaving because you are tired," he told me over dinner the night I resigned. "You are leaving because there are things money cannot repair once they break." He was right. At least I thought he was. I wanted ordinary mornings. Weekend grocery shopping. Quiet dinners without conference calls interrupting dessert. I wanted to become invisible to boardrooms and visible to the person waiting for me at home. So I accepted only private advisory work. No titles. No interviews. No photographs. My name slowly disappeared from magazines, conference agendas, and business television. I was happier that way, or at least I believed I was. Susan's voice pulled me back to the present. "Ethan," I looked up. "Sorry. Go ahead." The forensic team just uploaded another batch of records. New files appeared across the monitors. Hundreds of internal messages. Calendar entries. Approval chains. Meeting invitations. Daniel scanned the summaries before looking directly at me. There is one name that appears more often than anyone else's. I stepped beside him. The same executive had approved, reviewed, or redirected nearly every questionable transaction over the previous 14 months. Richard Hayes, the current chief executive officer. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. Robert finally broke the silence. "Before anyone reaches a conclusion, remember what Mr. Walker said. Facts only." I nodded in agreement. "Exactly. Patterns create suspicion. Evidence creates decisions." At that exact moment, the conference room door opened quietly. Robert's executive assistant stepped inside carrying a tablet. "Chairman," she said carefully, "Mr. Hayes has arrived. He says he was informed there is an emergency meeting." Robert looked toward me instead of answering her. The room followed his eyes once again. I closed the folder in front of me, straightened the sleeves of my inexpensive charcoal suit, and took one slow breath. "Please invite him in." It is time we all started asking the same questions. The conference room became so quiet that I could hear the soft click of the door latch as Richard Hayes stepped inside. He wore the same confidence he had carried at every shareholder meeting for the past 6 years. His midnight blue suit looked custom-made. His silver cuff links caught the light with every movement. He smiled the way experienced executives often do when they believe they are walking into a discussion they already understand. That smile lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then he noticed every board member seated around the table. Then he noticed the financial reports covering every monitor. Finally, his eyes settled on me. The smile disappeared without anyone saying a word. "Chairman," Richard began. Looking toward Robert Whitman, "Your assistant said there was an emergency." Robert gestured toward the empty chair halfway down the table. "Please have a seat." Richard remained standing for another moment before speaking again. "Would someone mind explaining why an outside consultant is sitting in this meeting?" Several directors exchanged brief glances, but nobody answered immediately. Robert folded his hands together. "Mr. Walker is here because I asked him to be here." Richard looked at me again, studying my face more carefully this time. "Have we met?" "Not formally," I replied, "although I have read many of your quarterly reports." He gave a polite nod. "Then I assume you understand the seriousness of interrupting a board session without advance notice." "I do." "Good." He sat down slowly. "Then perhaps someone can tell me what this is about." Susan Keller activated another display. The audit committee identified several financial irregularities approximately 1 hour ago. Richard barely reacted. Irregularities happen. That is why companies perform audits. Daniel Brooks leaned forward. These irregularities involve executive authorization codes. Richard's expression remained composed, but I noticed the smallest pause before he answered. "Go on." Susan displayed the transaction timeline we had reviewed earlier. Several approvals appear to originate from your executive credentials. Richard looked at the screen for less than 10 seconds before answering. "Then someone has compromised the system." "Possibly," I said calmly. He turned toward me. "You seem eager to speak." "Only when the facts require it." He leaned back in his chair. Please, I would love to hear your opinion. I stood and walked toward the monitor again. Opinions are not useful tonight. Patterns are. I pointed to the first highlighted transaction. This authorization occurred while you were attending the London Infrastructure Summit. Richard nodded. Correct. Your passport confirms you entered the United Kingdom 48 hours earlier. Correct again. I touched the next entry. This approval required biometric confirmation from headquarters. Richard frowned slightly. Then, the system malfunctioned. Perhaps. I advanced to another slide. Except the same pattern repeated 4 months later while you were speaking in Toronto. Another screen appeared. Then another. Every highlighted approval matched an event placing Richard hundreds or thousands of miles away from corporate headquarters. Nobody interrupted. Richard remained calm, but his eyes no longer carried the relaxed confidence he had entered with. Robert quietly asked, Richard, were you aware of these duplicate authorization records? No. Did you ever delegate emergency credentials? Absolutely not. Daniel spoke next. Then we need to determine how they existed. Richard nodded. Agreed. I studied him carefully while everyone else focused on the documents. Years of crisis work had taught me that answers rarely lived inside words alone. They lived inside timing, breathing, the hesitation before someone chose one sentence instead of another. Richard was not panicking. He was thinking. That interested me more than fear ever could. Susan brought up another report. We also recovered internal scheduling records. Richard glanced toward the screen. And several executive strategy meetings were added to your calendar after you had already departed for international travel. Richard looked genuinely confused. That is impossible. I quietly asked. Do you personally manage your calendar? No. My executive office does. Including your chief of staff? Yes. I nodded once without commenting further. Robert noticed. You are thinking about something. Maybe. Richard looked directly at me. If you have a question, ask it. I met his eyes. Who besides you would benefit if investigators believed your credentials had been used? The room fell silent again. Richard answered almost immediately. Anyone trying to shift attention toward me. Exactly. Daniel slowly looked up from his notes. You think someone wanted us to discover this? Yes, I replied. These records are too visible. Whoever created them expected experienced auditors to find them eventually. Susan frowned. Meaning they are bait. That is my concern. Robert leaned back thoughtfully. So if Richard is not necessarily the target, then he may be the distraction. I finished. The room absorbed the possibility one careful breath at a time. Richard slowly folded his hands together. For the first time since entering the conference room, he looked directly at me without the slightest trace of skepticism. Who are you, really? I smiled faintly. Tonight, I am simply the person trying to keep this company from making the wrong decision. Before anyone could speak again, Robert's assistant entered carrying another tablet. Her expression had changed. Chairman, she said carefully, security has just informed me that one executive attempted to access the restricted accounting archive from the ballroom less than 5 minutes ago. Robert looked up immediately. Who? She swallowed once before reading the name displayed on the screen. Chad Bennett. No one spoke for several seconds after Chad Bennett's name echoed through the conference room. The silence felt heavier than any accusation could have. Robert Whitman slowly turned toward his assistant. Repeat exactly what security reported. She looked down at the tablet again. At 9:23 this evening, Mr. Bennett attempted to access the restricted accounting archive from a workstation located in the executive hospitality lounge adjacent to the ballroom. The request was automatically denied because the archive entered emergency protection mode 5 minutes earlier. Daniel Brooks frowned. That archive is invisible to anyone outside finance. Susan Keller nodded. Most executives do not even know it exists. Richard Hayes looked genuinely puzzled. Why would Chad be searching for accounting records during the annual gala? Nobody answered immediately. I walked toward the conference room window overlooking the city lights below. Thousands of headlights crawled through downtown Chicago like tiny rivers of white and red. From 38 floors above the streets, everything appeared organized, calm, predictable. Businesses often looked the same from the outside. The real story usually unfolded somewhere nobody could see. I turned back toward the room. Because he was looking for something specific. Robert folded his arms. We're trying to remove something. I nodded. That possibility cannot be ignored. Susan quickly opened another report. Can we see exactly what file he requested? Her fingers moved across the keyboard. Seconds later, another screen appeared. Every access attempt had been logged automatically. She froze for a moment before reading the file name aloud. Emergency Governance Amendment. Revision 4. Daniel looked up immediately. That document has not been referenced in years. Robert quietly smiled without humor. Unless someone recently became interested in understanding who still has emergency authority. Richard turned toward me. Revision 4. Was that your work? Yes. What changed in that revision? I took a slow breath before answering. It created an independent review process. If evidence suggested executive manipulation during a corporate emergency, operational authority could temporarily shift away from management until the board completed its investigation. Richard stared at me. Meaning tonight. Meaning exactly tonight. Susan looked from me to Robert. Then Chad was not searching financial records at all. No, I replied. He was searching the rules. Daniel leaned back slowly. He wanted to know who could stop whatever was happening. Robert looked toward the assistant. Where is Mr. Bennett now? According to security, he returned to the ballroom approximately 3 minutes after the access attempt failed. I checked my watch for the first time that evening. Time had begun moving differently. Faster. Every minute now carried consequences. Do not remove him, I said. Several directors looked surprised. Daniel spoke first. You want security to leave him alone? Yes. Why? I looked around the room before answering. Because people who think they are still invisible continue making mistakes. The moment he realizes we are watching him, every useful decision stops. Richard slowly nodded. You want him comfortable? Exactly. Robert smiled faintly. Still playing the long game. I shrugged slightly. The short game creates headlines. The long game finds the truth. Susan suddenly raised another point. There is something that still bothers me. Go ahead, I said. If Chad needed governance documents tonight, someone must have told him there was an emergency before the ballroom knew. The room became quiet again. She was right. That detail changed everything. Richard looked toward Robert. How many people knew this meeting had been called? Robert answered immediately. The audit committee, legal counsel, my executive office, Mr. Walker, and the board. Daniel slowly added. Nobody else should have known. I walked back toward the monitor displaying the access log. One timestamp immediately caught my attention. 9:23. Robert had called me for the third time at approximately 9:17. The ballroom screens had gone dark at roughly 9:20. Chad attempted to access the archive at 9:23. That sequence was too precise to ignore. Susan, I said quietly, show me communication logs from 9:15 until 9:25. More windows appeared across the monitors. Internal messages, badge activity, telephone records, calendar alerts. Hundreds of digital footprints filled the screens. Then one notification stood out from all the others. Susan stopped typing. This message originated from an executive assistant account. Daniel leaned closer. Who received it? Susan hesitated before answering. Only one person. Who? She looked toward Richard. Chad Bennett. Richard slowly stood from his chair and walked closer to the display himself. He read the message twice before speaking. Chairman has activated emergency governance. Meeting relocated. He looked back at us. Someone warned him. Robert's expression hardened for the first time all evening. Find the sender. Susan expanded the metadata attached to the message. The room waited in complete silence. Every second felt longer than the last. Finally, the system displayed the originating account. Susan read it carefully, almost as though she hoped she had misunderstood what she was seeing. The message was sent using credentials assigned to Madison Walker. My heartbeat did not change, but something inside me became perfectly still. Around the table, several directors immediately looked toward me, waiting for some visible reaction. I gave them none. Years of experience had taught me one difficult lesson. A name inside a computer system was not the same thing as the truth. I looked directly at Susan. Do not assume she sent it. Robert understood immediately. Explain. I kept my voice calm. Credentials can be borrowed. Devices can be left unattended. Accounts can be compromised. Tonight we investigate evidence, not people. Even as I said the words, one quiet question settled into the back of my mind. Somewhere beyond those conference room doors, Madison was still standing inside that ballroom, completely unaware that her name had just entered the center of a corporate crisis. The room remained silent long after Madison's name appeared on the screen. Nobody reached for conclusions. That alone told me I was sitting with experienced directors instead of emotional spectators. Robert Whitman slowly stood from his chair and looked around the table. Nobody outside this room hears that name until we know exactly what happened. Every director nodded. Susan Keller immediately locked the display and encrypted the communication logs. Daniel Brooks closed his notebook. Richard Hayes folded his arms and looked directly at me. You believe she may have been used? I believe evidence deserves context, I answered. Without context, honest people become suspects and guilty people disappear. Robert glanced toward his assistant. Can security quietly locate Madison Walker? Yes, Chairman. Do not question her. Simply ask her to remain available. Understood. She left the room without another word. I walked back to the monitor and reopened the message metadata. The sender account belonged to Madison, but something about the transmission bothered me. Susan, I said, expand the device authentication. She typed for several seconds before another report appeared. Interesting. What is it? Robert asked. The message was sent using Madison's credentials, but not from her assigned laptop. Daniel looked up. Her phone. Susan shook her head. No. A conference workstation. Richard frowned. The hospitality lounge. Correct. I looked toward Robert. Where Chad attempted to access the archive. Robert's eyes narrowed. So both events happened from the same location. Within 90 seconds of each other, Susan added. The pattern was becoming clearer. Richard stepped closer to the display. Can that workstation be used without logging out between users? Susan nodded. If someone leaves the session active. I quietly asked, how many people attended the executive networking reception before the gala? Robert answered immediately. Nearly every senior manager. Including Madison? Yes. I folded my arms and stared at the timeline. I had seen this strategy before. Years earlier, another company had nearly destroyed the career of an innocent executive because someone borrowed an unattended workstation during a reception. People trust familiar rooms more than unfamiliar people. That is why social engineering works. It depends less on technology than on ordinary human habits. Daniel looked at me. You have seen something like this before. Twice. And both times the first suspect turned out to be the easiest person to frame. Susan continued examining the authentication records. Suddenly, she stopped typing. Wait. Every head turned toward her. The workstation camera activated automatically when the session began. Robert immediately understood. Security footage? Susan smiled for the first time all evening. Not exactly. Still images captured for biometric confirmation. My heartbeat remained steady, but I felt the room change around me. Facts were finally beginning to replace theories. Can you recover them? I asked. Already trying. The loading indicator crawled across the monitor. 5 seconds. 10. 15. Nobody spoke. Finally, the first image appeared. It showed the hospitality lounge from above. Several executives stood around a high table discussing the upcoming awards ceremony. Madison was there, holding a glass of sparkling water while speaking with 2 directors from the marketing division. Chad Bennett stood several feet behind her. Susan advanced to the next image. Madison had stepped away toward another conversation. Chad remained near the workstation. Another image. Chad glanced around the room. While someone else laughed nearby. Another image. He moved closer to the unattended computer. Another image. His hand rested on the keyboard. Susan enlarged the timestamp. Madison's session was already open. Richard quietly exhaled. He used her login. Looks that way, Daniel said. The next image appeared. Chad typed rapidly while looking over his shoulder. Then another frame showed him removing a small flash drive from his jacket pocket. Susan froze the image immediately. There. Robert looked toward legal counsel. Document everything. Richard slowly sat back down, the tension leaving his shoulders for the first time since entering the room. That answers one question. Only one, I replied. We still do not know why. Robert looked at me. What do you think his objective was? I considered the images for a long moment before answering. He was not trying to steal money tonight. Then what? He was trying to survive tomorrow. Several directors looked puzzled. I continued. People hide evidence when they believe an investigation is coming. People rewrite rules when they believe authority is about to change. Chad searched the governance protocol because he needed to know who could stop him. Then he tried to reach restricted records before we did. Susan nodded slowly, meaning he knew the audit was closing in. Exactly. Robert walked toward the conference room door. Then we no longer have the luxury of waiting until morning. He turned toward the security director standing just outside. Quietly escort Mr. Bennett to conference room 4. Tell him the board would appreciate a brief discussion before the evening concludes. No accusations. No public attention. The director nodded once and disappeared down the hallway. Robert looked back at me. Would you like to lead the conversation? I glanced toward the leather folder still resting on the table beside my inexpensive charcoal suit jacket. No. Robert raised an eyebrow. Why not? I offered a faint smile. Because the moment he sees me asking questions, he will know we already understand far more than he expects. Tonight, I would rather let him underestimate me one last time. The board chose conference room 4 because it was smaller, quieter, and completely separated from the ballroom, where the gala continued as though nothing unusual had happened. Through the security cameras, we watched Chad Bennett leave the reception with one of Robert Whitman's security officers. He still wore the same confident smile he had carried all evening. He straightened his jacket as he walked, probably assuming he was about to receive an unexpected opportunity or answer a routine question. Confidence built on incomplete information rarely survives long. Robert stood beside the monitor with his hands folded behind his back. Security confirms he surrendered his phone voluntarily, he said. Daniel Brooks nodded. Good. Preserve everything before anyone contacts him. Susan Keller was already coordinating with the forensic team. Every email, badge scan, workstation log, and network session from the previous 24 hours was being copied into a protected archive. Nobody rushed. Good investigations move carefully because panic creates mistakes that evidence never forgets. 20 minutes later, Robert returned from conference room 4. He closed the door behind him and quietly removed his glasses. Nobody asked the question first. His expression answered enough of it. He admitted using the workstation, Robert said. He claims he only wanted to review governance procedures because he heard rumors about organizational changes. Richard Hayes slowly shook his head. Convenient. Robert continued. When presented with the authentication images, he acknowledged using Madison's open session without her knowledge. Susan exhaled softly. So she had nothing to do with the message. Correct, Robert replied. The forensic timeline supports his statement. Madison had already walked across the ballroom before the message was transmitted. I closed my eyes for one brief second. Not because I doubted her innocence, but because facts had finally caught up with instinct. Earlier that evening, everyone around us had been willing to judge people by appearances. Tonight, the evidence reminded us why appearances were the weakest form of truth. Daniel looked toward Robert. Did he explain? The flash drive. Robert nodded. It contained copies of governance documents and archived executive policies. Nothing indicates financial records were successfully removed. Richard leaned back in his chair, the tension slowly leaving his face. Then this was preparation, not execution. Exactly, I said. He wanted information before the board could act. Susan turned toward me. What happens now? I looked around the table before answering. Now we separate poor judgment from misconduct. Those are not always the same thing. Robert smiled faintly. That is why I wanted you here. Legal counsel reviewed the preliminary findings for nearly another hour. Chad's actions violated multiple internal policies and justified immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation, but nothing in the evidence supported the larger financial manipulation we had feared earlier. Instead, the deeper forensic review continued pointing toward weaknesses in outdated executive authorization systems rather than a coordinated conspiracy. It was not the dramatic answer people usually imagined. It was something far more common in large organizations. Small decisions, small shortcuts, small assumptions. Left alone long enough, they become large problems. Shortly after midnight, the board unanimously approved emergency system upgrades, an independent review of executive access procedures, and temporary oversight measures until every remaining question had been answered. No one celebrated. Responsible leadership rarely looks like victory. More often it looks like unfinished work accepted with humility. When the meeting finally adjourned, I gathered the leather folder, buttoned my inexpensive charcoal jacket, and walked back toward the ballroom. Most guests had already gone home. Hotel employees quietly cleared tables while the last few executives finished late conversations near the exit. Madison stood alone beside the windows overlooking the city. She turned the moment she heard my footsteps. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she looked at my suit before meeting my eyes again. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. I smiled gently. "For what?" Her voice carried none of the confidence from earlier that evening. "For thinking I understood who you were." I looked through the glass at the lights stretching across Chicago. "You knew the parts that mattered most to me." She shook her head. "No, I knew the parts you allowed everyone else to see." I thought about that for a moment before answering. "Maybe that is partly my fault." She frowned. "Why?" "Because I spent years trying so hard to leave my career outside our home that eventually I stopped talking about it altogether." She looked down for a second before quietly laughing at herself. "And I spent tonight worrying about the price tag inside your jacket." I glanced at the sleeve and smiled. "It still keeps me warm." She laughed softly, this time without embarrassment or performance. Just honesty. We walked together through the nearly empty hotel lobby toward the front entrance. The cool night air greeted us as the city continued moving beneath a sky full of lights. Before opening the passenger door of our car, Madison reached for my hand. "Can I ask you one question?" "Of course." "Why did the chairman trust you so completely?" I looked at the skyline one last time before answering. "Because leadership is never about being the loudest person in the room. It is about being the calmest one when everyone else forgets what matters." She squeezed my hand gently. Neither of us mentioned the suit again. By the end of the night, nobody who truly mattered remembered what it had cost. They remembered the decisions made by the man wearing it.